periodic table's fault. Yes, good? Okay, yay, yay, hi everybody. Thank you so much for coming. This is such a great turnout. I'm so happy to see all of your lovely faces. Welcome, this is our first, I think, lecture of the semester, given that it's the second week. I guess that would be correct. And I'm glad you could be here to join us for this super cool talk. I wrote some things down because if I don't, I'm an idiot and I forget important things, so I'm gonna read, sorry. But this part I didn't need to read. I'm Sandy Woodson, and Chen Zhu, who is back there leaning on the pole. He and I run the Daniels Fund for ethics at Mines. They're the ones that are giving us the money for this shindig, and he and I we teach in the Division of Humanities and Arts and Social Sciences. So there is a place like that on campus. It's a good place. It's not a mean place. We're nice people. Come visit us. But he and I kind of get to pass around money to good causes, and this is one of them. Just a little teeny bit of background. We got our first grant about 4 years ago, and in the last 4 years we've been spending a lot of time trying to help faculty who are here incorporate ethics into their classes. We've done a bit of that. We have an ethics library in Stratton Hall, which exists in time and space, which is weird. And we also we've been bringing in a lot of speakers. Most of our speakers have been about how to teach ethics, but now we're finding out that people want to learn about STEM and ethics, like specific STEM fields and ethics. And so the people who teach those things know those people who are really good at that, hence Katie. So this is a new initiative, is to provide support. So if you have ideas in your individual places, definitely come to me and or Chen. And we definitely want to thank the Daniels Fund for the money to make these kinds of cool events happen. And I want to thank Tom for making this cool event happen, and hand it over to Tom to do the formal introduction because he knows what he's talking about, and I don't. And it has nothing to do with the periodic table. That's all I know.
Yeah. All right, thank you.
You bet.
Okay, so first, before I get started, if you were in my robot ethics, in our robot ethics class, please come see me afterwards so I know who came to this talk. Thank you all for coming to this joint Haas computer science talk. I think we need more of those. It's my great pleasure to introduce Katie Winkle. Katie Winkle is from the Bristol Robotics Lab at the University of West of England, which is in Bristol, in England, in the United Kingdom. So she's come a long way to come here. Katie is great. She is an HRI pioneer who, if you are not one of the few people in the room who already knows what that means, it means she was selected last year as one of a couple dozen students viewed as rising stars in the field of human-robot interaction. She is a great scientist doing fundamental research on the underlying science of human-robot interaction, specifically within the area of persuasive robotics. But she's also a first-class engineer, which in my mind means she knows who her users are and talks to them. She designs technologies that will actually meaningfully improve the lives of those users, and she works to understand the actual implications societally and ethically of those technologies, which are all important skills for any engineer. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our speaker today, Katie Winkle.
Cool. All right, I'm going to see if I can clip this on. Is that okay? Yeah, awesome. Okay, cool. Well, thank you for the introduction. It's great that so many of you are here. Yeah, so I am indeed an engineer from sunny England, although right now it's not very sunny and the weather here is much better, so thanks for that. So I'm really interested in all things around social human-robot interaction, but really what I like to say is that I'm interested in using humans to make better robots and using robots to make better humans. So essentially I'm interested in how robots can make humans better at doing good stuff. So that's where the persuasion comes in. I do it for good purposes. It's not all evil, honestly. And how to make robots better with humans. That's really what Tom was saying about exploiting experts and human knowledge to really make robots that can kind of leverage that. So what I want to talk about today is really very much grounded in the context of my work as an HRI engineer. Well, why persuasive robots? Hopefully I can convince you that it's a good thing and we need to do it. What some of the ethical concerns are, not just in kind of persuasion, which is already perhaps ethically questionable in some cases, but also just the ethical concerns around designing these kinds of robots, and then how we might address them and ensure that, in designing these technologies, that we're being responsible in our innovation. And I've really highlighted the fact I am indeed an engineer. Tom is quite kind to call me a scientist. I hope I am a scientist as well. But really, this isn't going to be a philosophical talk. It's going to be one that's rooted in like my practice and in the applications that I've done and in the approaches that I've taken. And I hope to convince you that by pursuing responsible innovation and by being ethical in my work, it really has led to better robots, right? This isn't just a checkbox exercise. This is really about how to be responsible in a way that leads to better systems and makes me a better engineer. So for those of you who might not be familiar with social robots, this is kind of a classic definition from like 2003, and it just highlights the fact that social robots are those that can take part in interactions with humans, in social interactions with humans. So they can do things like make conversation, use cues like gaze and gesturing. They might have suggest that they have emotions. They can perceive your emotions. They're often about trying to get some sort of relationship with the user, and they might have a personality or a character. So they might not be humanoid. So I've worked with Pepper a lot, so Pepper is a humanoid, but they might look like animals. They might even just be like, pets or aliens. But the point is that they can kind of create this bond with you or can try to create a relationship with you. And then just to go one step further, specifically I work in the area of socially assistive robots. So those are social robots that are designed to provide some useful helping function through that social interaction. So for me, this is very quickly how I get into the persuasion stuff, because actually when we talk about assistance, what we're generally talking about is trying to prompt or encourage particular user behavior. So in health, that could be trying to get people to do their exercises, perhaps helping them with weight loss. In independent living, telling people when they need to drink or eat or reminding them about something. In education, it could be helping with homework. So really, you can probably see where we're going with this, When I first started my PhD and I got interested in this area, one of the applications that really stood out for me was in therapy, because if you've had a stroke or some sort of accident, then actually directly afterwards, the amount of rehabilitation you do is directly correlated with how much better you will get. But unfortunately, those exercises are actually generally pretty boring. So if you've had a stroke, it might be, flipping through a magazine or moving pens in pots, and people drop out really fast. And there's just not enough therapists to go around, right? There's not enough therapists to have someone with you all the time telling you what to do. And so I thought, well, yeah, okay, that's a fun application. It had already been initially demonstrated. So that picture in the middle, that robot barely looks social, right? It's like a turtle thing on the floor. And yet they already showed that if people thought that robot was watching them and was interested in what they were doing, then they would do more exercise. So I thought, great, this is the application I want to do. It's a good cause. I'm going to work on that. So it seemed obvious to me that I would go away to the literature and that some of these roboticists who'd done this work with therapy would have gone and talked to some therapists. No, they hadn't. And so I ended up coming up with a study where I was like, actually, therapists are great at this. Therapists know when to push you and when to back off, and they know how to form good relationships. And so I thought, okay, I'll just do it myself. Like, no one's done it, fine, I'll have to go and do that. So I wanted to design a qualitative study where I wanted to go and do some focus groups and some interviews, and I did go and actually observe some sessions as well, really to start exploring, what do therapists think about this? Before I even go in there with my assumptions, what do therapists think about social robots for therapy? What ideas do they have? And then as experts, how do they do this? Maybe that can inform my robot design. And very early, talking to therapists, it became clear that they take very personalized approaches with each patient, as you might expect. So I wanted to try and explore that and understand that so that, again, it could feed into my robot design. So this is my first pitch, I guess, for responsible design, because I really took the time to think about how to engage with these people meaningfully. And so I've just thrown up my focus group structure. So I did a mech eng undergrad. I had never run a focus group before, right? That's not a thing that engineers do generally. And I think it's a shame. I think it's a shame that we don't do that. So I ended up actually publishing this methodology, which just goes to show how little it is thought about in the field. But what was cool about my focus groups was I brought all the therapists into a room, and before I said anything about what I thought or what my ideas were, I was just like, so this is a social robot, what do you think? And really invited them to give me their broadest ideas before I then took the time after we'd done that. Then I went in and was like, okay, cool, well, this is what I think based on what I've read, and I hear what you're saying, and let me show you my demos. And then we had this kind of great mutual learning experience. And then once I'd done that, we could still obviously talk about my very specific research questions, so I didn't lose out on addressing my research questions. And just to kind of show you why that's good, or I hopefully demonstrate that that's a good thing. Of course, they were able to give me loads of ideas for applications that I hadn't considered. So those are nicely tucked away in my future research bank. But also, I still was able to answer my very specific research questions because I made sure that we still did that. They were able to tell me a load of real-world considerations that I just hadn't thought about, actually, that were both A, academically interesting and for sure have led me in directions that I wouldn't have thought about, but also crucial to acceptability. So I had patients tell me about, okay, you're going to put the robot in the home, but how's that going to affect this guy's wife or the kids? And actually, what about me as a therapist? I don't want to get blocked out of this interaction. So how do you kind of think about these issues? And the other really cool thing is, these focus groups, they were probably like an hour, maybe an hour and a half. And we gave people a questionnaire before and afterwards, measuring how much they were willing to work with these robots and what their acceptance was. And we got a significant shift in the participants' acceptance. They were coming in and they were like, nah, I'm not sure about this, and how you're going to replace me, and I'm not sure you're going to ever have a robot that can be useful. And by the end of it, they were like, great, when do I get one? Let's get started. I'm genuinely not exaggerating. I have therapists from this study, which was a couple of years ago now. They're still in touch. They still send me articles of stuff they've seen. And so it was mutually beneficial. And if that's not enough, and I promise I'm not just bragging here, it did lead to my first Best Paper Award. Again, genuinely not a brag. The point is that this led to some really good work, and it led to insights that were valuable for the entire community. And so that's my first pitch for why responsible innovation and responsible methods result in good research. Okay, so that aside, as I said, one of the key reasons for doing this study ultimately was, I wanted to understand what do therapists do and how we could therefore replicate it in a robot. And I kind of found out, okay, there's two ways, two key things going on when you've got a therapist helping someone engage in their exercises. Once the patient is motivated, then it's really facilitation, right? It's like, okay, this person's motivated, I just need to help them with some scheduling or make sure they've got the right equipment. And that's easy to do, right? We could do that with apps or watches or whatever. Actually, the majority of what they do is really about social influence, and it's really about, okay, they go in there and they try to reason with the patient, you need to do this because it's going to make you better. That doesn't always work. So then it comes down to kind of the real social interaction between them. So actually making it a fun thing to do, actually having a bit of authority sometimes and kind of telling them off a little bit, and providing that sense of accountability, I'm going to see my therapist next week, and if I haven't done my steps, then she's going to tell me off or whatever. And that's really how I got from social assistance to social influence. I was like, okay, what they're really doing is kind of leveraging their social relationship with the patient in order to try and get them to do this good stuff that they're supposed to do. So luckily I have very patient supervisors who just let me research what I want mostly. So I was like, I'm going to go away and read persuasion literature. And I started looking at different models of persuasion, and this particular model really jumped out at me because it just seemed to fit what the therapists were telling me. So the elaboration likelihood model of persuasion is a model that basically tries to explain the way in which we process a persuasive message when we receive it. So right now I'm trying to convince you that socially persuasive robots are good and that doing ethical work is also good. And so there's two ways you might process all the stuff that I'm saying. If you are interested in this topic and you kind of want to think about it and you're able to understand the kind of stuff that I'm saying, then you will rationalize what I'm saying and decide whether you agree or not. If you're perhaps in the wrong room or a bit tired this afternoon and actually you don't want to engage with what I'm saying, that's fine. But instead you'll just kind of assess me as the speaker. So you'll be like, does Katie seem legit? Is she credible? Do I like her? Do we have things in common? And actually, it will really be about your assessment of me rather than what I'm saying. And what we find is that when we're thinking about social assistance scenarios, so scenarios where people don't really, who wants to listen to a lecture on why they should do their exercise? They know why they should do their exercise. They just don't really want to do it. Do your homework or whatever, drink water. It's probably that this low elaboration type of persuasion that's going to be happening. And so luckily for us, the literature also tells you how to try and generate that. So how to try and generate these credibility and likability cues that are going to make you persuasive. So hopefully this is one thing you can at least take away from the talk today, right? You'll all be super persuasive when you're finished. So the ones highlighted in bold are the ones that we will test on the robot, and I'll share that with you in a minute. But essentially, you can cite your expertise or your information source. You can show goodwill. That's where the social interaction comes in. So how are you doing? Good, great, I'm glad to hear that. Bad, oh, well, I'm sorry to hear that. What's the matter? Taking an interest, being empathetic. You can try and emphasize your similarity to the receiver. So, oh, you're from England, right? It rains there a lot. It's raining here today, cool. Or whatever it might be. It's just finding some common ground to try and create this closeness. You can be introduced by a credible third party. So I had that today, right? You're all super, convinced because Tom gave me a great introduction. You can use try and adopt an appropriate language or delivery style, and you should demonstrate honesty and sincerity. And so just to convince you that this really did match up to what the therapists were telling me, I just included a couple of quotes. So one guy was telling me, yeah, whatever their condition is, I always talk a little bit about it just to make sure they know that, I know what I'm talking about. And this thing about the goodwill and the similarity and the empathy and the interest, I had one therapist who was a male speech and language therapist, which is quite rare in the UK. And he was talking about this woman, this older woman that he goes to see, and he was like, yeah, I really have to go and make her laugh. It has to be a social visit for her. And she knows that I'm going to pester her a little bit, but as long as it's mixed in with the jokes and the fun, then she'll generally do what I ask her to do. So, they certainly wouldn't call it persuasion. They would use words like the therapeutic alliance and the working relationship and the therapeutic relationship. But for me, what they're really doing is building and leveraging their kind of social relationship in order to get the patient to do the stuff that they should do. So I wanted to try and see whether this would work in a social robot. So I designed a study looking at exactly some of these strategies. So we had an expert robot, where the robot basically gave them a load of information about a particular condition that the study was designed around. We had a similarity robot. So the robot would ask some questions like, is it better to exercise alone or with others, with music or with TV? And whatever you said, the robot would say the same, like, yeah, I also chose that. I agree for sure. And we had a goodwill robot. So this was the one trying to show some interest. So, I really want to get to know you. How are you doing? And whatever you said, it would give the appropriate response. So if you said great, it would be like great. If you said not good, it would be like, oh no, I'm sorry to hear that. Let's try and cheer you up. And then we had a control. So the control had exactly the same to and fro, had the same, question answer, the same length of dialogue, but it was just really like basic small talk, like, oh, yeah, I'm from Paris, I was built in Paris, have you worked with a robot like me before? What's the weather like? It was just really kind of, basic stuff. And so in the study, we set Pepper up as a sort of physiotherapy instructor, but we hired completely healthy people, right? So there was no intrinsic motivation for them to do the exercise we asked them. We specifically asked them to do a really boring, like a wrist turn, which is used to treat tennis elbow. And we set up the study such that it was open-ended. So the idea was that we'd have a really nice objective measure of how persuasive the robot was. The idea being like, the more repetitions they chose to do, the more persuasive our robot had been. And once they'd got started, there was very little interaction. The robot, you can see every few repetitions, it would say like, good job, or great, or keep going. And if they stopped, the robot would say, oh, looks like you finished, do you want to stop? And if they did, it would stop. Otherwise, it would cap out at like 30 repetitions. So that was for me, it was nice that we had this objective measure, right? Finally, some quantitative data, seeing as I am an engineer and a scientist and whatever else. But we also did do some questionnaire measures. So we tried to measure credibility of the robot using a measure that's from the human-human interaction literature linked to the ELM model that I mentioned. So that's trying to assess things like expertise, trustworthiness, goodwill, and sociability, because those are the kind of the constructs of credibility. And we also included a likability questionnaire, and that's from the Godspeed, which is quite a common measure used in HRI. And then just a couple more additional measures. We asked people about relationship with the robot. I mean, it was quite a short experiment, but still, we wanted to like see if there was a difference in, do you feel you developed a relationship with the robot versus do you think the robot developed a relationship with you? And we also asked about genuineness, and I'm happy to argue afterwards with you what you think genuineness is in the context of robots. But I guess what we were trying to get a feel for was whether people bought in to the kind of social stuff the robot was saying, especially the similarity, right? It kind of feels a bit weird to be like, yeah, of course, whatever you chose, I chose it too. And so we kind of wanted to try and get a feel for whether people bought into that. And the great thing was with this study, directly after people had finished, I had a brief interview with them where I was able to kind of go through these questions in a bit more detail. So these were really starting points for a broader discussion. Great, so I've got my study design, I was ready to go. I was like, yep, I've done some psychology, that's really cool. And suddenly one of my supervisors, as I was kind of pitching this, was like, I don't think we should do this. This seems super deceptive and unethical. And I was really like surprised. Like, I hadn't really thought about it before. And she said, we're kind of intentionally having the robot suggest that it's got emotions and feelings that it just doesn't. And you're telling me you want to use this to make people do stuff? And I was like, yeah, right, what's wrong with that? And so actually, I decided to still run the study anyway, because I thought it was I'd really thought about the study, and I think all I was doing was emulating what therapists had done, but it did really make me stop and think about, well, actually, like, maybe I need to think about this a little bit more. And so we added a final question that kind of said, and we were really upfront about it once they'd finished the study. This was obviously, there's a bit of a concern growing amongst roboticists that this could be deceptive because the robot can't feel emotions. And do you think the robot that you saw today was deceptive? So that we could discuss it. So that was my first kind of, my first foray into kind of dealing with some of these issues. So in terms of the results, first of all, the goodwill and the similarity conditions really did significantly increase how much exercise people did. I mean, you can see from the figure, like most people in those conditions, or a lot of them, really maxed out at 30 repetitions. I mean, that was quite surprising to me to see such strong results. You can see like the expertise was kind of less. It was kind of approaching significance, but it didn't really get there. But the goodwill and the similarity, we were super blown away by. I was amazed that just by having the robot say, have you had a good day today, yes or no, and giving a semi-appropriate response, that this is kind of the output we could get. It was kind of exciting and terrifying at the same time. But interestingly, we did not see such results in the questionnaire measures, so the credibility and the likability. We saw no variation between the groups. And on top of that, we saw no correlation in the number of repetitions people did and what they put on those questionnaires. Now, that's a weird result, because certainly in human-human interaction, how you score me on those questionnaires is almost certainly going to correlate very strongly with how persuasive I am to you. And so it really raises, well, first of all, for the HRI community, it's a big problem because it kind of raises questions about if we're using questionnaires like that as an idea to get an idea of what people think about robots, and they don't tie up with people's behavior, then they're probably not that useful. So I'm kind of moaning at people all the time to try and find more objective measures. But from the interviews, what we learned is that really it's because people are rationalizing very hard when they're answering these questions. So, that wrist turn, that really shows that people responded to the robot in a social way. But when you ask them to stop and think about it, kind of rationale gets in the way. Actually, if you ask someone, is a robot honest? They're like, well, a robot can't be honest, right? Because it's only what it's been programmed to be. So that's why I think there's this discrepancy. Another interesting result was the question on relationship development. So most people, so there was a significant difference in how that question was answered. So most people recognized that perhaps they were giving a relationship to the robot, but they weren't getting that back. And that's quite important when we are thinking about deception, because it suggests, okay, fine, they bought into the social behavior, but they do recognize that the robot isn't actually feeling stuff towards them. So that's a good, a plus point for making sure we're not being deceptive in that way. And then finally, in terms of this kind of genuineness question and the deception questions, we got really quite mixed results. So in the genuineness, for example, I mean, it was literally on a scale of 1 to 5, how genuine do you think it is? And look at how mixed the results are. So almost half of participants gave a 1 or 2 out of 5, not very genuine at all. But a quarter gave 5 out of 5, super genuine. And it's okay, cool. So how, what's going on there? And I just picked out this one particular quote to show how complex this thinking is. So this person was like, yeah, well, I felt it was genuine, but that's, I'm aware that someone else programmed it to be genuine, but I'm okay with that because I feel like whoever had made the program in the first place wanted the person exercising to feel comfortable and cared about, so yeah, that's cool. And I was like, yeah, well, that's not complicated at all. But that quote, it's important because it shows when we're thinking about people interacting with robots and we're asking them about this, they're no longer just thinking about the robot. They really are thinking about what are we using the robot for, who programmed it, probably who paid for it is becoming increasingly important. And so it's just another point as to why we should be designing and engineering and thinking about robots within their system, within their kind of overall ecosystem. So yeah, again, another point about kind of, it's not just the robot, right? The robot is just part of a larger product or a larger intervention or a larger social system. And then finally, on the deception and acceptability, so we'd ask them, is it deceptive? And if it is deceptive, is it acceptable? Most people found the robot either not deceptive or deceptive but acceptable, and the acceptability was generally linked with the application. So again, yeah, you're making people exercise, that's a good thing to do. Interestingly, so the orange one, the orange color, if you can, orange-brown color, that's deceptive but acceptable. And you'll see that even in the control condition, there was a good chunk of people who felt that that was the case, almost a similar amount actually across all of the conditions. And so the deceptiveness wasn't really about that dialogue, it was more about just the idea of a social robot in general. Really, people were kind of like, well, I'm not really sure how much the robot actually understands out of what I'm doing, and so they were concerned about deception in that case. So the robot's saying good job, and they're like, I have no idea whether it actually knows whether I'm doing a good job or not. But overall, quite kind of promising. There was a little, so the blue color, that's people who said it was deceptive and unacceptable, and it was a very small number of participants. But again, because I'd done the interview afterwards, which I always recommend now, I don't run many studies these days where I don't try and take time to talk to people afterwards. For those people, it was mostly because they just didn't like it. They were like, I don't need this social interaction, and it was unacceptable because they didn't like it, rather than kind of ethically unacceptable. So quite interesting, and again, I think quite positive thinking about moving forwards. But I still kind of wasn't totally convinced, it's quite daunting. You go around thinking you're doing a good job, and when one of your supervisors is like, you're deceptive and unethical, you kind of sit up and listen. And so I wanted to kind of see a little bit more and really turn it into a research question, actually. So I asked kind of, well, where do I go from here? And she pointed me in the direction of quite, at the time, a recent publication, which is British Standard 8611. And that was kind of the first engineering standard for trying to design robots ethically. And so it's really a tool. Again, like as an engineer, I was like, okay, there's got to be a tool, a standard, something that can help me make sure that I'm doing a good job. And I started looking through this document, which is designed to help you identify ethical hazards and how to kind of address them. And actually, I got really disappointed and disheartened, because straight away, two of the big risks that they mention is deception and not being what they call like upfront about the robotic nature of the system, and anthropomorphization. And they're basically like, don't do it. I'm like, well, there's an entire field called social robotics, which is literally, this is what we do. And so I also didn't really feel like that was great. And I was like, okay, no, I'm going to run a study. I'm going to try and answer this question. And so I wanted to kind of think about, well, how deceptive do we really need to be in order to be effective? Because I've kind of showed that we do, like these social behaviors are important, but I wanted to explore whether there's a way we could get that result whilst being a bit more ethical and or less deceptive. So this was a smaller study, it was an online study because it was really a side project. It wasn't supposed to be part of my work. I'm not an ethics PhD person. So the first part was varying like the expertise of the robot. So we had a robot that presented itself as an expert, like I'm a specialist in using physiotherapy. I think that you've got tennis elbow. I think that you should, blah, 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 versus a robot that kept third-partying to the human. So, I've been programmed by your therapist, Laura. Laura says this. Laura thinks that you should, blah, blah, blah. And of course, we had a control as well. And then more on the social interaction side, we were looking at kind of the very anthropomorphic, I want to get to know you. Where are you from? Bristol. Oh, I'm from Bristol too, or I live in Bristol too. And oh yeah, I know that exercising can be boring or hard, but it's important. Versus, and that was kind of the more deceptive potentially one according to that standard. And then we had a more ethical version. So it still had the same social kind of dynamics. So, I want to get to know you, but so that I can personalize my interaction with you. Oh, where are you from? I'm from Bristol. Oh, the laboratory where I was programmed is from Bristol. So you've got this kind of upfrontness about the robotic nature. And instead of saying, I know that exercising can be hard, it was, many patients find exercising boring or hard. So really trying to match the patterns, but just going for this more ethical dialogue. The rationale being, if we could run a study and see how that dialogue did or didn't affect the credibility and the likability, then we could say something about whether there was a need for this deception in the first place. So yeah, these were within subject online studies. So the actor is me, if it's not obvious, and we just basically put it out online, and we had the same questionnaires as before. So we got like credibility, likability, relationship development, but obviously we'd lost the objective measure that I was so excited about. So we tried to put in a few proxies to at least get a feel. It's obviously not the same, and I would never say it's the same, but at least some questions to try and get a feel for, how much responsibility would they give the robot? Which robot did they find the most motivating? Which one would they work with? At least to be able to say something about how these dialogues might influence perception of the robot. So on the robot expertise, what we found is that the one that referenced the human was almost universally preferred. It was pretty much scored better on most of the scales. It got given the most responsibility, and there was quite a clear preference for it, both in terms of most motivating and which one people would prefer to work with. So on expertise, 100% more ethical actually probably could make it a better persuader. And I think that's important because it's still the case that most roboticists are going in and trying to design these kind of standalone agents, when really we should be thinking about the interaction between, in my case, the therapist and the robot and the team that they make. And you'll see in my most recent study that's becoming a bit of a theme for me. I'm interested in human-robot teams. But yeah, so in this case, more ethical, better persuasion, great. I'm being ethical, I'm still doing persuasion, it's all good. The deceptive one wasn't quite this way. So actually in this case, it was the potentially deceptive robot that got better scores. In this case, being more ethical might lead to worse persuasive ability. Now, I 100%, one of the first things I want to do when I actually finish my thesis is run an objective study with the wrist turns again, or something similar, where we test out this dialogue in a real environment, because it's unclear exactly how much of a difference it will make. But this is at least enough for me to want to bring the two communities together and be like, yeah, we need to talk, because actually, in addressing the ethical concerns, we might lose some effectiveness, or by maximizing effectiveness, we might be getting into ethical hazards. And so certainly there's enough evidence at least that we need to understand it a little bit better. All right, so, okay, cool. So I've done a study with therapists, and I've done some persuasion stuff, and now I really do need to build a robot, right? That was what I set out to do at the start of my PhD. And I was like, so what does all of this mean? So if we tie together what I'd learned from the therapists and what I'd learned from the persuasion study, the ideal, intelligent, socially assistive robot, if it's trying to convince you to do your exercise, then it should be kind of looking at what you're doing, how are you feeling, what's going on, and deciding what type of persuasive strategy to take. So should it be throwing rationale at you? Should it just be a comforting presence? What's the right thing to do right now? And of course, in order to figure that out, it should be looking at how you're performing right now and whether you're happy or sad, or tired or not tired. But it should also be drawing on lots of other information, right? It probably, maybe the therapist told it that, yeah, Kate is really grumpy in the morning, you should probably do it in the afternoon. Maybe it's learned that about me by working with me for some time. It's got knowledge of me and my past interactions with it. How on earth do you build an architecture that does that? Or like, where on earth do you just, show me some AI out of the box that's ready to do something as complicated as this? And I was like, the therapists were really good at this, right? So let's use their expertise. This is even better. I don't have to do it myself. So the therapists were really good at telling us like what was important. They just couldn't put their finger on how, because a lot of what they do is super intuitive, right? I mean, a lot of our social skills are super intuitive anyway, but for them, it's really quite an on-the-spot, and it's actually brilliant. If you ever go and watch a therapy session, they are brilliant. I was fortunate enough to observe some speech and language and some physio, and they're excellent. And so I thought, okay, well, maybe there's a way I can have them teach the robot what to do. And so we specifically used interactive machine learning. So what's going on here is that the human expert is kind of watching from afar what is happening and is telling the robot in real time, right, do this, do this, do this. And over time, the robot learns from those examples until it can start making suggestions itself. And then the expert can give can give feedback on those, like, yep, that was a good suggestion, go ahead and do it, or no, don't. And for me, this is, again, honestly, like, it's a responsible way of automating my system. You know, participatory design and co-design, they're normally focused on bringing experts in at the beginning to get ideas, to get feedback. This method essentially allowed the experts to stay with me all the way through to the automation part. And so for me, it means that, okay, it's not completely transparent depending on what algorithm you put underneath. I mean, I'm not going to talk about algorithms because it doesn't really matter. What's cool here is the approach. You just find the right algorithm that kind of fits the approach. But what it means is that the robot's only ever going to do stuff that it's been shown, and you know who's shown it. It's a human expert, and that human expert is always going to be human-centered because this is what they're good at. So for me, this is another, it's the right tool for the job from a technical point of view, but it also is again an example of responsible innovation. So just to be clear, to begin with, the robot knows nothing. All it knows is that it doesn't know anything. You've got your domain expert telling it what to do, and it learns from those examples. So I wanted to test out whether this approach would work in a real-world useful scenario. So I picked fitness coach, kind of moved away from therapy a little bit just because it's hard to get hold of like groups of patients. But we picked an NHS, which is like the UK's National Health Service. We picked a program that they do, which is Couch to 5K. So it's currently delivered by podcast, and it's an exercise program that's designed to get you running 5 kilometers over like 9 weeks of sessions, and it kind of builds you up. So you start off walking, running for a minute at a time, and then it builds you up to pure like 45-minute runs. And so my research questions were, okay, it's a 9-week program, so over the 9 weeks of having this kind of machine learning approach, can we generate enough training data to have the robot going autonomously by the end? And secondly, this approach, this machine learning approach, does it work better than just having a simple kind of heuristic-driven system where those heuristics have been designed with the same person, the same fitness instructor, which I guess for me was like the next best participatory design approach. That's, getting the fitness instructor to tell me the rules that should control the robot. So before the study even started, I spent well over 12 hours pure design time with a fitness instructor from the university. So we talked about what are the actions that the robot should do, what would be the inputs for the machine learning system. So what are the things that he thinks are important when he's deciding whether to tell a joke, or when to push someone harder, or when to slow it down. We also designed the teaching interface. So you'll see in the photo in a minute, but he actually had a little tablet that he was telling the robot what to do through. And we obviously designed the heuristics. So the output of this was 2 versions of the robot. We've got the machine learning robot, which knows nothing, has an action space that the teacher's going to use, and has an input space. And we have the heuristic robot, the one that's following the simple rules that he's designed. I say simple, I mean, they weren't that simple actually. Like, he really thought about, well, if the speed is low but the heart rate is high, then they might be struggling, so you should sympathize. Whereas if everything's low, you need to challenge them. So they weren't, I'm perhaps doing them a disservice by saying they were simple. They were things that he thought about, and we worked together on a lot. So already at the design stage, we found that the machine learning robot was able to have access to more actions. So what I mean by that is, in the heuristic system, if you're following a rule-based, there were some actions that the instructor just couldn't come up with a rule for. Like, actually, telling a joke is quite hard to do. If you do it at the wrong time, you completely throw someone off their run and then potentially destroy your credibility. And similarly, like, having the robot tell the person to speed up, it's really dangerous to do that with a rule, right? Because if you tell them to speed up at the wrong time, they could actually hurt themselves. So already, by following the machine learning approach, we had the potential for more interesting behaviors that we just couldn't have done with the heuristic system. And then the second table just gives you an idea of some of the inputs that he identified. Now, this was good, right? Because this approach means he didn't have to tell me how they were important, just that they were important. So he was like, yeah, facial expression is important. He couldn't link it to a rule or a behavior, but that's okay because the machine learning kind of does that for you. So in terms of the experimental setup, this is what it looked like. So that's my fitness instructor, Don. That's a participant on the treadmill talking to Pepper. it doesn't really show it on this on very well in this photo, but Don was quite far removed from the interaction. So when they were exercising, they really were working with the robot. Don was quite kind of hidden away a little bit. So we put it in my university's gym for 3 months over the summer. Don was the guy I worked with both for the design, and he then did all of the training of the robot and the facilitation of the sessions. We had 10 participants, so 1 dropped out halfway through, but 9 people followed it all the way through, came and worked out with the robot 3 times a week for 9 weeks, which is awesome. And over that time, they saw 3 versions of the robot. So they saw the machine learning robot while it was being controlled / supervised by him. They saw that machine learning robot again running autonomously, just doing the best thing without him interfering, and they saw the heuristic-based system. So the first question was, well, could we make it run autonomously successfully by the end? The graph's not great, but what it's essentially trying to show is that the column on the right is kind of the actions or the proportion of each type of action that was chosen by the fitness instructor. And the one in the middle is what the autonomous system did. So actually, we did kind of replicate quite well the fitness instructor's behavior. And the one on the right, the far right, is the heuristic system. So even though the same person designed these heuristics, the resultant behavior was completely different, right? And it was way more limited, and it was generally rated as not so good. The other thing that's not shown here is, as well as I think successfully making the robot run autonomously in quite a good way, we also saw evidence of personalized behavior. So the fitness instructor was taking different approaches with different people, and the robot seemed to replicate that. So fine, big ticks on the technical. But I almost don't want to talk about the technical quite so much, because it's really cool to put a robot in a real world environment for like 9 weeks. It's hard to do, but you get to see some really cool social interactions and get a feel for how the robot really could fit into quite an intense social situation. So, from the participants' point of view, they were really cool about it, because I was like, I think at the beginning, some of them were quite skeptical about having a robot fitness companion. But by the end, they were saying, yeah, it did a great job, and it was really like my gym buddy, and it made me want to try my best. And then interestingly, I never really thought about the fitness instructor as a participant, but he kind of was, right? Because he was working with this robot, 3 times a week, 10 participants over 9 weeks. It's a lot of time he spent with the robot. And we had some really great conversations about, well, is the robot just a mini version of him, or did he see it as a different person? And he really felt it was a colleague. And we saw some really cool stuff, like towards the end of the study, the sessions got longer and longer. And so he would be like stretching out the previous participant, and the next person would come in and he'd just get them started on the robot, and then he'd go back and carry on stretching with the previous participant. And that was really cool to see for me as a roboticist, how he that was a real teammate, right? And that's how he referred to it, as his colleague. And then the other thing that I just want to mention is, I said before, I'm really interested in the fact that the robot doesn't need to act in isolation. Like, let it utilize the human expertise, let it be a teammate or whatever. And this final comment was someone who said, the combination of having Pepper the robot and Don the fitness instructor really was what made the experience, because she was quite happy working with the robot during the session, but the fact that Don was there in the background was quite reassuring to her. And so I think you can totally imagine the gym of the future, where each treadmill has its own robot, but there's still the human presence in the background kind of supervising. And that's actually super feasible, right? Like in healthcare, that would be a great way of making sure we don't lose the human-human interaction, but that we address the fact that we just don't have enough humans to give everyone that kind of one-to-one supervision. So yeah, fine, my autonomous results demonstrate the technical potential, but what's potentially more exciting is that these people's experiences hopefully demonstrate the social potential of this neat triadic interaction. I think that's pretty much about it. So just to conclude then, I hope that I'm designing socially persuasive robots ethically. Still sometimes feels like a juxtaposition to say that, but I think we're working on it. I think, and hopefully I've shown that I think socially assistive robots need to be persuasive and intelligent to be effective. And the question is how to do that ethically. I think a lot of it is about understanding the risks of deception and anthropomorphization, and exploring, like in that kind of online study, how we can make sure we get the desired effect whilst being as low ethical risk as possible. It's a lot about working with users and domain experts. It sounds so simple, but engineers don't do it enough. Really to think about the impact of these systems that we're designing. And hopefully I've shown you some of the practical methods around participatory and co-design, and even at the end, you know, the machine learning approaches that have allowed me to keep expert human involvement throughout my work. And if you're still asking why, I really hope I've convinced you that it will lead to better robots. You know, this is not just do it because we should. This is like do it because it will make us better at what we do. Yeah, that's it. So thanks. Yeah, hey.
Great talk.
Thank you.
Very interested in where this goes. I might have missed it at the beginning, but
sure.
Was the mode of communication between the robot and the humans voice or text?
In which part? All of it, I guess.
Well,
yeah.
I don't know.
Sure.
Was it? Did you have different?
Yeah, so it's always been voice, pretty much. With the online studies, it was voice, but also with subtitles. And similarly, in the gym study, it was voice, but also with subtitles on the tablet as well.
So, follow-up question
sure.
then is, when assessing credibility and likability,
yeah.
How might changing the kind of voice that you're hearing affect that, like a posh accent versus a working class accent?
Yeah, for sure. Sure. It's a really great question. So I haven't varied that in my work, but my first study ever as a master's, I put like a Scottish accent on my now. And that was great fun. And for me, like, you know, as you saw, one of the persuasive strategies is about like similarity and the correct adopting the right language style. I think class, in the UK, class would be a big one, actually. And we've also, in the discussions with the therapists, the gender thing has come up as well. So some people, for example, if you've got an older British gentleman, it's very difficult for him to have like a young female therapist if it's like a physical therapist. And we have these ideas around like, well, maybe we should make the robot a male for him, like why not? But then you also do run the risk of like, you don't want to kind of reinforce gender stereotypes. And I think like, I don't want to go too far into that because it's not my area. I think it's another one for discussion, right? If you can show me that making my robot a woman is going to increase its effectiveness, we kind of need to have that discussion, and we need to weigh up the ethical risk. Again, it's kind of about weighing up the risk versus the benefit. I think it will have an impact. I think that impact will be personal. A great thing with robots is we can personalize it, so maybe we should, but we just need to be mindful of some of the bigger issues we might end up tapping into. Yeah. Hey.
So for these studies, did you use a female presenting voice on Pepper?
It was just Pepper's standard voice, and we didn't so we never referred to it as he or she. We didn't change anything beyond like the standard settings. Yeah. Maybe over there first. Yeah.
Did you ever encounter any bugs with the robot?
Any bugs with the robot? Well, so the bugs with the robot would be the bugs in my programming, right? I'm not sure I want to admit to those here. Yeah, so certainly like the technical system for the gym study was really hard, and I put it together in like 3 months. It was like 6,000 lines of Python, and it was a bit mental. And in the first exercise session, the robot didn't stop. So the person, like, it was meant to be, you know, run for a minute, walk for a minute. And like, the person had been running for like 5 minutes. And I kind of looked at the fitness instructor, and he looked at me, and I was like, I think you're gonna have to take this one over, because like he could be going for a really long time. Yeah, so there was a few bugs, but luckily like in those studies, like, you know, it was a long study, so it didn't matter too much. Yeah, the robot itself is pretty decent actually, so nothing too bad apart from that one poor guy who ran a lot. I think, yeah, you want to go next?
So kind of going back to what you had said about the differences with what voice would
Yeah.
use effectiveness, and you're talking about like personalizing the voice.
Yeah.
For different people. Have you thought at all about how the difference between what voice would be most effective for people versus what voice they would prefer, and how that kind of...
Yeah, that's so, I mean, not just with voice, right? That's just a really good question in general, because sometimes what we think we would like to work with is probably not what's going to push us hard. This is why, so one of the obvious critiques people can take with my work is so far I've really focused on like the therapists rather than the patients themselves. That's just because, you know, that's kind of the research I've done to date. But actually, in situations like this, you need to take what the users say with a pinch of salt, Because if I ask you, well, yeah, do you want the robot that's like really harsh, or do you want the one that's really nice? You're probably going to say the one that's really nice, and that might not be the best one for pushing you. And I think it comes down to, once again, you know, like with the persuasion study, I was on about the wrist turns as a measure. That was a good measure, right? Because it didn't ask them what they preferred, it was just which one made them work the best. So yeah, I haven't really thought about it in terms of like voice specifically, but I think it's a good thing to think about moving forwards, is that users don't always know what's good for them, but obviously they do need to have a say, and there is things that they can teach us. So I think balancing the thing between teacher and user, or therapist and patient, is something we should think quite carefully about. Sure.
So you mentioned earlier about how there was some kind of ethical concerns with designing a deceptive robot, like persuasive. So where do you draw the line with where do you stop research? Where do you stop doing these investigations? Where's the ethical line that you
That back.
Oh yeah, sure. So the question was, there's the concern that this is unethical and deceptive, and where do I stop the research? Where do I just cut it off and say this is? I don't know, genuinely. And I don't think anyone really does. So as I told you, I thought that when I'd done my persuasion study, I was like, yeah, makes lots of sense. It's a real model from psychology literature. It's what therapists are doing. I didn't see, I'm being a bit over the top, but I didn't see any major concerns. It was only when my supervisor turned around and was like, yeah, this is really bad, I'm not sure we should do it, that I stopped and thought about it. And when I went to the literature, that British standard really was like, no anthropomorphization, no deception. And it was like, well, that's clearly not really a sensible stance either, right? Because actually there's an entire field that is doing exactly this. And so I really don't think there is an answer to that right now. I think that's why it's important, though, that because we can't answer that question, we should just be taking the most ethical and responsible approaches and embedding them in our design methods, embedding them in the way that we operate, always engaging with people from the ethics field, always engaging with users, with experts, just to make sure we're on the right side. I don't want to put people off doing research. That's not what, and I don't think ethicists do either. That's not what it's about. It's just about making sure we ask these questions in the right way, and then hopefully we will get closer and closer to really, narrowing down that grey area and making sure that we're always on the right side, I would say.
So I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah.
So you segued into where I wanted to direct the inquiry. So
sure.
It's about interdisciplinarity and where it lives. From Tom's introduction through your whole project presentation, you exemplify an engineer who's trained to read the big picture, to ask the hard questions.
Sure.
We're trying to create programs that result in precisely people like you.
Oh, great.
Who are doing what you do.
Thank you.
I run a program that lives exactly in this space. I want to replicate you.
Awesome. More me.
But also, I'm always confounded by the limit of the individual. So you're trained as an engineer, and now you find yourself doing social science research methods, and now you're studying theoretical frameworks for persuasion, and now you're doing psychology. At some point, wouldn't it be better just to hire experts in all this? But at the same time, I want more of you in the world. So how do you experience in your own work?
Sure.
When should I learn how to do something brand new? Versus when do I really need to call in?
It's such an excellent question. I'm really fortunate that so the lab that I work in is 200 people. We've got psychologists, we've got a professor of robot ethics. I work very closely with an occupational therapist. For me, that's the right thing, and I think I genuinely never try to go too far with this. I'm very quick to defer to someone who knows. And I think I would love to see, and it's difficult, in the UK, the funding bodies, they want to see interdisciplinarity, but then how do you make the case that you're still doing something niche and specialist? And I think that question goes way beyond even an institution. It does, you get into the realms of well, actually, I want to do this research, who's the right collaborator? And then you kind of get into the realms of they need to know a bit about engineering, and I need to know a bit about social science. I don't think there's an easy answer to this question, right? That's kind of why it's worth thinking about. I think a lot of it can be achieved by having, just talking to people on your campus. And like I said, that's in my own case. I've just been fortunate enough to be surrounded by people who are willing to have those discussions. I also think that actually, like, the study with the therapists really showed me, if I just by taking 10, 20 minutes to let them teach me and for me to teach them, that also really led to cool and interesting things. So maybe there's ways that just we can train engineers to just be more open to that. I think that would solve a lot of the problems. And maybe we just need to also be better at recognizing that interdisciplinarity is a good thing. I think people are always very nervous that, you know, oh, if I bring them on board, it's going to turn into a social sciences project, or if I bring them on board, it's going to turn into, we need to kind of drop away a little bit and stop thinking just in the constraints of our own department, our own field, our own specialism, and recognize that working with others is a strength and not a weakness, actually. Yeah, I'm totally sidestepping your question, though, because it's really hard. I don't know.
That's a great note to end. If you have additional questions, please come up and bother Katie later, but now let's give her a round of applause.